Today is 16 November 2021. I feel very compelled to do another video to update about Dr. Yang's effort to whistleblow to the Singapore government about Pfizer using falsified clinical trials data. On 13 November 2021, Dr. Yang made a police report reporting that Pfizer had failed to ensure accurate data in their clinical trials. This is documented in the British Medical Journal, which is a very prestigious medical journal in UK. A regional director who was employed at the research organisation Vanderveer Research Group has told the British Medical Journal that Pfizer falsified data, unblinded patients, employed inadequately trained vaccinators, and was slow to follow up on adverse events reported in Pfizer's phase 3 clinical trials. Staff who conducted quality control checks were overwhelmed by the volume of problems they were finding. After repeatedly notifying Vanderveer of these problems, the regional director, Brock Jackson, emailed a complaint to US FDA. However, Vanderveer fired Brock Jackson later the same day. Brock Jackson had provided the British Medical Journal with dozens of internal company documents, photos, audio recordings, and emails to whistleblow about Pfizer's falsified clinical trials data. So, Dr. Yang's police report on 13 November 2021 also include the fact that FDA had completely ignored the whistleblowing by, by Brock Jackson, and FDA commissioner was actually transferred to a very well-paid job at Pfizer. So, Dr. Yang, in his police report on 13 November, had whistleblowed about Pfizer using falsified data in their phase 3 clinical trials as published in the British Medical Journal. So you can go read out about it by checking it on DuckDuckGo. And the police report also included about FDA's dishonest act of completely ignoring the whistleblowing and apparently a possible corruption whereby the FDA commissioner was actually transferred to a very well-paid job at Pfizer. So Dr. Yang is a Singaporean medical doctor of 2 HSA-approved vaccination centers in Singapore. And Dr. Yang is putting his career on the line because he understands that by making this police report, he would likely lose his job. So in Dr. Yang's police report, it included evidence published by British Medical Journal about Pfizer falsifying its clinical trials data, as well as FDA's dishonest history, which includes totally ignoring the whistleblowing by Brock Jackson. So Dr. Yang signed off his police report as a Singaporean whistleblower. So that's on the 13th November 2021 when Dr. Yang made a police report saying that Pfizer had falsified its clinical trials data and also about FDA's dishonest behavior by ignoring the whistleblowing by Brock Jackson about Pfizer's falsified clinical trials data. On the 15th of November 2021, Dr. Yang had written a letter to Prime Minister of Singapore Lee Hsien Loong, whereby he wants to update something of potential national significance. So in the letter on the 15th November 2021 to Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, Dr. Yang said he wished to update Lee Hsien Loong and his cabinet colleagues that the Singapore Police Force has initiated an investigation on Pfizer for alleged phase 3 vaccine clinical trials data fraud. This is the police report that Dr. Yang had filed on the 13th of November 2021. So the letter continues to say that the British Medical Journal has agreed to share the evidence of fraud with the Singapore Police Force, and as a courtesy, Dr. Yang hoped that the Foreign Minister of Singapore can give a personal call to his Israel counterpart to inform him of this investigation and the progress. So this investigation refers to the Singapore Police Force investigation into Pfizer for falsifying its phase 3 clinical trials data after Dr. Yang had made the police report on the 13th of November 2021. So Dr. Yang said this is very important because many Israeli children between 5 to 11 have already started getting Pfizer COVID vaccines in Israel. So Dr. Yang said he has the utmost respect for professionalism of the Singapore Police Force to conduct a comprehensive and transparent investigation to protect the young children of Singapore and Israel after he had made the police report on 13 November 2021. In the letter to Lee Hsien Loong on 15 November 2021, Dr. Yang also said he humbly recommends the Minister of Finance to urgently form a working group to advise the leadership of Singapore government about our sovereign funds. And this is crucial for the early purchase of put options on Pfizer. This is to protect the savings and the investments of the people of Singapore. This is because the Singapore government had started to buy a new batch of Pfizer COVID vaccines for children between 5 to 11 years old. So in a letter on 15 November 2021 to Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, Dr. Yang also said, "May I gently propose that the Attorneys General Chambers urgently study if criminal acts, including criminal negligence by the parties, can release the Singapore from confidential Pfizer agreement and make Pfizer pay for injuries caused by the alleged criminal acts. Usually, commercial contracts are voided by criminal acts, and a list of sizable Pfizer assets should be compiled as the investigation progresses." This is because the Singapore government has signed a secret agreement with Pfizer, and Dr. Yang is saying that if Pfizer is found to have committed a criminal act by falsifying its phase 3 clinical trials data, then this can possibly free the Singapore government from the secret agreement that it had signed with Pfizer. And Dr. Yang signed off by saying that he has the utmost faith in Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and his cabinet to wisely navigate Singapore through these rough waters during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Yang signed off as a Singaporean whistleblower, and he's a medical director of 2 HSA-approved vaccination centers. And he he's he may lose his job just for filing a police report and whistleblowing about Pfizer's possible criminal act of falsifying its clinical trials data to the Singapore government. Okay, let's look at today's news, whereby Singapore's children vaccination trial is already making progress, and the Singapore government is planning to start recruiting the first batch of children between 5 to 11 years old for vaccine trials. So today's news states that Singapore is actually making progress in its children vaccination trials. So our Health Minister Ong Ye Kung had announced during the press conference today on 15 November 2021 that children vaccination trials are underway in Singapore, and KK Hospital will be overseeing the vaccine trials for children. And KKH is starting to recruit the first batch of children between 5 to 11 years old for the Pfizer vaccine trials in Singapore. So Ong Ye Kung made this announcement during the press conference today on 15 November 2021. However, Dr. Yang had already made a police report to the Singapore Police Force on the 13 November 2021 about Pfizer falsifying its phase 3 clinical trials data. So, and on the 15th of November, Dr. Yang had written a letter to Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong to update our Prime Minister that Singapore Police Force has initiated an investigation on Pfizer for phase 3 clinical trials data fraud. So, why is it that despite knowing about Dr. Yang's police report on 13 November 2021 and the letter that Dr. Yang had written to Lee Hsien Loong on the 15th of November 2021, why is the Singapore government still going ahead with its children vaccination trials in Singapore by using Pfizer vaccines? So why is the Singapore government still going ahead with using Pfizer vaccines onto children between 5 to 11 years old in Singapore? The Expert Committee on COVID-19 Vaccination is finalizing its recommendations on vaccination for children between the ages of 5 and 12 using the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. So the Singapore government is going to announce very soon about its vaccination plan for children between 5 to 11 years old in Singapore about the use of Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. But children between 5 to 11 years old are not much affected by COVID virus if they are infected. So why is the Singapore government still going ahead to vaccinate children between 5 to 11 years old for COVID when children are not much affected by the COVID virus even if they are infected? And this is very disturbing when COVID-19 vaccines are being given to young children between 5 to 11 years old, especially for those who are healthy. So the Singapore government also announced that MOH has signed a new supply agreement with Pfizer to deliver the Pfizer vaccines for children. And Singapore is in contact with Pfizer, who will try to fulfill the deliveries as soon as possible. So the new Pfizer vaccine for children is 1/3 the dose of the adult dose of the Pfizer vaccine for adults, and it includes a heart stabilizer medicine. Why does the Pfizer vaccine for children include a heart stabilizer medicine for children? This is because Pfizer has probably realized that many teenagers suffered from heart inflammation after taking Pfizer vaccines. So that is why it has added a heart stabilizer medicine for the Pfizer children vaccine to prevent children between 5 to 11 years old from getting heart inflammation and possible heart attacks after taking the Pfizer vaccine for children. So I'm just thinking that's very disturbing that Dr. Yang had made a police report on 30 November 2021, and on the 15th of November, Dr. Yang had written a letter to inform Lee Hsien Loong about his police report and the fact that the Singapore Police Force is currently doing an investigation into Pfizer falsifying its clinical trials data. But today we see the news that the Singapore government is still going ahead to vaccinate children between 5 to 11 years old, when children between 5 to 11 years old are not much affected by COVID virus, even if they're infected. So it's very disturbing that Pfizer vaccines are going to be given to children between 5 to 11 years old in Singapore, especially those who are healthy. And the Singapore government had actually signed a new supply agreement with Pfizer to supply the Pfizer vaccine for children. And it's disturbing to know that the Pfizer vaccine for children, although it's 1/3 the dose of the adult vaccine, includes a heart stabilizing medicine, probably to prevent children from getting heart inflammation and possible heart attacks after taking Pfizer vaccines. So this is very disturbing because the Singapore government has been pushing COVID vaccines very hard onto the Singapore population, and Singapore government is now punishing the remaining 5% of the adult population who has not taken Pfizer, who has not taken COVID vaccines. Singapore government is punishing the unvaxxed in Singapore very hard by banning them from almost everything in Singapore. And on the 1st of January 2022, employees in Singapore will be made to choose between jab or job. So my question, after giving COVID vaccines to children between 5 to 11 years old, will the Singapore government use vaccination differentiated measures on to children? Will children also be subjected to the same discrimination and punishment by the Singapore government for not taking COVID vaccines? Will there be a scenario of school children being forced to choose between jabs or school in the near future in year 2022? It could be possible, although the Singapore government now say they will not use vaccine differentiated measures on children. But Singapore government and the MMTF has been known to flip-flop and roti prata and keep changing its policies and keep shifting the goalposts. So we never know in year 2022, Singapore children between 5 to 11 years old may be subjected to the same vaccine differentiated measures as adults and teenagers 13 years old and above. What they have been subjected to right now. So the Singapore children also may be banned from almost everything in Singapore, and they may be forced to choose between jabs or school. Singapore government and MMTF have gone back on their words, and they have shifted the goalposts and keep flip-flopping on their policies. A few months ago, earlier this year, the Singapore government has said COVID vaccines will be voluntary, and employers cannot fire employees for not taking COVID vaccine. However, a few months later, right now in November 2021, unvaxxed in Singapore are being banned from almost everything in Singapore. So Singapore government has discriminated and punished the unvaxxed in Singapore by not allowing them to go to malls, not allowing them to dine, not allowing them to go to attractions. So the Singapore government and MMTF have gone back on their words by punishing the unvaccinated people in Singapore so hard. And in 1st January 2022, adults in Singapore will be forced to choose between jabs or jobs. So with the Singapore government rolling out the vaccination for children between 5 to 11 years old, we never know several months down the road in year 2022 what will happen to school children in Singapore. They may also be discriminated and punished by being banned from many things in Singapore, or worse, being forced to choose between jabs or school. So it's very disturbing that Dr. Yang had made police report on 13 November 2021, and Dr. Yang had written a letter to Lee Hsien Loong and the Singapore government informing him that the Singapore Police Force is currently investigating Pfizer for falsifying its clinical trials data. But today we still see the news from the Singapore government and MOH and MMTF that Singapore is still going ahead to vaccinate children between 5 to 11 years old. And this is very disturbing. And the Singapore government has actually signed another new supply contract with Pfizer to supply the vaccines for children. So Dr. Yang had actually started two petitions. He started one petition on the 12th November 2021 on change.org. However, it has been removed within one day when he has gathered about 7,000 signatures. And on the 15th of November 2021, Dr. Yang reinstated his petition on change.org. However, his petition has been removed again by change.org. So he made a police report about the removal or the censorship of his petitions on change.org. So this is Dr. Yang's police report on the 15th November 2021 about the alleged interference of domestic politics by a foreign actor. So Dr. Yang said he's a Singaporean, and change.org is owned by Bill Gates, a foreign actor, and change.org and Bill Gates are interfering the Singapore domestic politics by suppressing his petitions on the Nuremberg Code to the Singapore Prime Minister. So Dr. Yang said last week on 12th November 2021, change.org took down his petition, and after he reposted it, it was again removed. So Dr. Yang said these ongoing and robust actions by foreign actors has a lot to gain and benefit from the suppression of the Nuremberg Code in Singapore. And this is very, very disturbing to him as a Singapore citizen. Because Bill Gates also owns, through his Gates Foundation, some shares in Pfizer. Bill Gates is the one who owned Moderna. So Bill Gates has ownership in both Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. So Bill Gates will stand to greatly profit from the human experimentation of young Singaporean children. So in the police report, Dr. Yang says Bill Gates owns strategic investments in Pfizer and Moderna, and Bill Gates is also the owner of change.org. So Bill Gates has much to gain and benefit by taking down his petitions to the Singapore government and to Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong to inform them about the Nuremberg Code and the dangers of doing human experimentation in Singapore by giving COVID vaccines to the Singapore population and especially to Singapore children between 5 to 11 years old. And incidentally, Bill Gates is now in Singapore from November 16 to 13, 16 to 19 at Capella Singapore Hotel for the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. So Bill Gates is right now in Singapore, whereby the Singapore government can detain him and question him and interrogate him about his involvement, his ownership in Pfizer, Moderna, and change.org, which has taken down two petitions by Dr. Yang to tell the Singapore government and warn the Singapore government about the Nuremberg Code and to stop the human experimentation of giving COVID vaccines to the Singapore population. So Dr. Yang again signed off as a Singapore whistleblower and Nuremberg Code educationist and activist. So why is COVID vaccines being considered a human experimentation? This is because COVID vaccines trials for Pfizer and Moderna will not end until 2023. So everyone who is taking COVID vaccines right now, from now until 2023, are in a huge human experimental trial. And the COVID vaccines are given in Singapore as well as in other countries under EUA, Emergency Use Authorization. So the COVID vaccines are being given to the Singapore population under EUA, and Singapore government has been suppressing news about ivermectin possibly treating COVID-19. Ivermectin has successfully helped reduce COVID cases in countries like Indonesia, Japan, India, and Africa, but this news has been greatly suppressed by the Singapore government. And if ivermectin is found to be a proven cure for COVID-19, then the Singapore government cannot force COVID vaccines onto the Singapore population using EUA, Emergency Use Authorization. So the Singapore government has been pushing COVID vaccines very hard onto the Singapore population since early this year. And Singapore is now one of the highest vaccinated country in the world, 85% being vaccinated. However, Singapore government's vaccine only strategy has shown to fail because at 85% of the population being vaccinated, Singapore's COVID cases and deaths are still high and rising and show no signs of coming down, despite the unvaccinated people in Singapore being banned from almost everything since 13 October 2021. So unvaccinated people in Singapore have been banned from almost everything and just quarantined their homes and to outdoor spaces for close to 1 month. But the COVID cases and deaths in Singapore are still very high and rising and show no signs of coming down. So this is starting to look like a pandemic of the vaccinated and not a pandemic of the unvaccinated. And from data coming out from Israel and UK, most of the hospitalizations are of vaccinated people. Singapore government has been claiming that most of the hospitalizations in Singapore are from unvaccinated people, but Singapore government has stopped showing any data breaking down the percentage of those in the hospital into vaccinated and unvaccinated people. So Singapore government is concealing and hiding a lot of information from the public, yet claiming that most of the hospitalizations are from unvaccinated people. How can we trust the Singapore government about their facts and figures and their statistics when they are concealing it and hiding it from the Singapore population? So we have to question the Singapore government about the statistics that they are hiding from Singaporeans. We have to question the Singapore government about pursuing just a vaccination only strategy for Singapore, which has shown that it is not working anymore. It has failed, but the Singapore government is still not looking into the possible use of ivermectin to treat COVID in Singapore, and the Singapore government is still pushing very hard and relentlessly to give COVID vaccines to the Singapore population. And now Singapore government is going to give to children between 5 to 11 years old. So in my previous videos, I have already mentioned that Singapore government has invested billions of dollars into Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. So Temasek has invested US 250 million into Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. Singapore EDB has invested US $500 million together with other investors into Moderna vaccine. Ho Ching, who is the head of Temasek, is on the board of Wellcome Leap, which is a company that does research in mRNA vaccines. And Pfizer is setting up an office and factory in Singapore. So Singapore government has huge investments and vested interests in Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. Let's look at the petition that Dr. Yang had actually started on change.org on 15th of November 2021, but it had been taken down. So the petition, so he reinstated his petition, which he originally started on the 12th November 2021. But that petition had been taken down, so he reinstated his petition again on 15 November 2021. And the petition is getting Singapore leaders to understand the Nuremberg Code. Because Gan Kim Yong had stated that the Bloomberg Forum, which is being held in Singapore from today until 19 November 2021, is a vote of confidence for Singapore. So Dr. Yang said, Dear Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, So he wished to educate the Singapore government about the Nuremberg Code. So recently there has been speculations by leaders to keep pushing vaccines onto Singaporeans via the duress of losing COVID vaccines. So if Singaporeans do not subject ourselves and our children to endless injection of novel compounds, Singaporeans may lose their jobs and get banned from malls, from dining in, from going to attractions. So the Singapore government is pushing COVID vaccines very hard onto the Singapore population and threatening Singaporeans that if we don't continue to keep taking COVID vaccines, we will not maintain our vaccinated status, and we also will lose our jobs. Dr. Yang continues to state that the vaccines are 100% experimental and hence are placed under emergency use authorization only. However, Dr. Yang said to Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and the Singapore government the emergency is over because people and VIPs from all over the world are now coming into Singapore and having meals in groups of up to 5 people in Singapore. So Singapore government has started opening up many vaccinated travel lanes with many countries, and many foreigners are coming into Singapore every day on these vaccinated travel lanes. And in this week, Singapore is hosting the Bloomberg New Economy Forum from today until 19 November 2021. So Dr. Yang is saying, so when so many foreigners are coming into Singapore for a good time, there is no longer an emergency in Singapore. So without a current emergency, these experiments under duress are 100% not justifiable. And this is actually according to FDA. FDA states EUA will only allow the use of unapproved medical products or unapproved users of approved medical products in an emergency. So now there's no emergency in Singapore, and therefore COVID vaccines cannot be forced onto the Singapore population anymore, especially under duress. So he wants to inform Singapore government about the Nuremberg Code, which states the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent and should be situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. So Dr. Yang is telling our Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and the Singapore government to allow all Singapore citizens and parents to have the basic right to an enlightened decision. This is because Dr. Yang has been saying that COVID vaccines is being forced onto the Singapore population, and many Singaporeans are being forced to take COVID vaccines under duress so that they can maintain a vaccinated status to continue to go to malls, to dine in, and to go to attractions. And also, many employees have been forced to take COVID vaccines under duress just to keep their jobs because they are being forced to choose between jabs or jobs. So again, Dr. Yang signed off his petition as medical director of two HSA approved vaccination centers, and he is a COVID-19 frontliner and hyper pro vaxxer, whereby he has personally vaccinated many hundreds of people in Singapore. So he has started a petition on 12th November 2021, but the petition had been removed by change.org. So he reinstated his petition on the 15th of November 2021. However, his second petition had been removed again by change.org. So he had filed a police report. On the 15th November 2021 about change.org, which is being owned by Bill Gates, removing his two petitions to the Singapore government. And he says Bill Gates is exercising foreign interference in Singapore by removing his petitions to the Singapore government and to Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. And Bill Gates has ownership in Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. So there's a conflict of interest there. And Bill Gates is actually right now in Singapore for the Bloomberg Forum. So the Singapore government can actually go and investigate and interrogate and detain Bill Gates now for foreign interference. So Dr. Yang had actually started trying to inform and talk to the Singapore government about COVID vaccines on 10 November 2021. So Dr. Yang actually started on 10 November 2021 by writing a letter to Ho Ching. Ho Ching is the head of Temasek and the wife of Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. So he had written a letter to Ho Ching on the 10 November 2021 about possible mathematical errors that Ho Ching's Facebook post contained about vaccination and other important factual matters. Because Ho Ching has been pushing for 3 Sinovac or Sinopharm vaccines to be considered fully vaccinated in Singapore, whereby, however, China has only approved 2 doses for fully vaccinated status. So Dr. Yang says that 3 doses of Sinovac or Sinopharm vaccine shots has not been endorsed by the manufacturers for some age groups. So the third shot of Sinovac or Sinopharm is actually a de facto experiment for some population segments. This is because the data for 3 shots of Sinovac or Sinopharm vaccines are still lacking in peer-reviewed P3 data. So Dr. Yang said, according to the Nuremberg Code, does he have to inform his patients that for some segments of the Singapore population, the third Sinovac or Sinopharm shot is actually just an experiment, because deadly human experimentation requires full consent and not under duress by the participants. So Dr. Yang find it very disturbing that Ho Ching has been saying that a third shot of Sinovac or Sinopharm is required to have a fully vaccinated status in Singapore. So we find it very disturbing that a third shot of Sinovac or Sinopharm may be mandatory for a person to be considered fully vaccinated in Singapore and to keep a job. So he asked Ho Ching, could any consent conducted under strong duress be considered illegal? This potentially coercive action to force a potentially deadly medical experiment on Singaporeans is very disturbing to him at the front lines. Dr. Yang also questioned Ho Ching about pushing for the third booster shot of Pfizer and Moderna next year in year 2022 to to maintain the vaccinated status in Singapore. Because Ho Ching says that next year, in year 2022, only those who have taken 3 shots of Pfizer or Moderna vaccines will be considered fully vaccinated in Singapore. So Dr. Yang is asking Ho Ching, what is her mathematical basis for that? Ho Ching, who is the head of Temasek and the wife of Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, has been putting up many Facebook posts on her Facebook page pushing for COVID vaccines. So Ho Ching has been endorsing COVID vaccines to be given to the Singapore population, and Ho Ching has been endorsing that the vaccination only strategy is the one to be pursued in Singapore. And she has dismissed ivermectin as a possible cure. So Ho Ching is the head of Temasek, and we know that Temasek has invested US $250 million in Pfizer BioNTech, and Ho Ching is the wife of Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, and Singapore government EDB Singapore had invested US 500 million in Moderna, and Singapore government has signed a secret contract with Pfizer, and Pfizer is setting up a factory and office in Singapore. And Ho Ching herself is on the board of Wellcome Leap, which is a company that does research in mRNA vaccines. So Ho Ching, Singapore government have huge investments and vested interest in COVID vaccines. So is that why they are pushing Pfizer and Moderna vaccines so hard onto the Singapore population? And is that why they are requiring 3 doses of Sinovac or Sinopharm shots to be considered fully vaccinated in Singapore, when in China 2 doses alone are considered fully vaccinated? So you can know more about Dr. Yang's first police report on Pfizer's falsified clinical trials data and his letter to Ho Ching on my first YouTube video. You can go to my BitChute channel to take a look at this video. Okay, my BitChute channel is Singapore Gal Vlog, which is the same name as my YouTube channel. This video about Dr. Yang's police report on Pfizer's falsified clinical trials data, which he made on the 13th November 2021, and letter to Ho Ching on the 10th of November 2021. This video on YouTube has already gathered more than 21k views. So that is the first video I did about Dr. Yang, and today is the second video I did about Dr. Yang to update about his efforts to inform the Singapore government about Pfizer possibly doing a criminal act by falsifying its clinical trials data, and telling the Singapore government to stop Pfizer vaccines in Singapore for a while Singapore Police Force is currently investigating into his police report about Pfizer falsifying clinical trials data. So Dr. Yang is would like to tell the Singapore government to stop giving Pfizer vaccines for now, as the Singapore Police Force is investigating into Pfizer. And it's very disturbing that the Singapore government had announced today that actually, despite Dr. Yang's police report and open letter to Lee Hsien Loong, that SPH Singapore SPF Singapore Police Force is investigating into Pfizer. It's very disturbing to see that Singapore government is announcing today that it is going to continue the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines in Singapore, including Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, and Singapore government is going to start giving Pfizer vaccines to children between 5 to 11 years old in Singapore. So this is very disturbing. So my question is, why is the Singapore government still going ahead full steam to give Pfizer vaccines to children between 5 to 11 years old when Dr. Yang had already made police report on 13 November 2021, and Dr. Yang had written a letter on 15 November 2021 to Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, informing him that the Singapore Police Force is investigating Pfizer for possible criminal act of falsifying its clinical trials data.